Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Peterson's basic description of science and the way in which science fits with religious claims, theistic claims, Christian claims. Uh, Peterson thinks that the kinds of explanations that theology or philosophy of religion typically provides are about the purposes for which God created the world, and they're compatible with or complementary to the kinds of explanations that science provides, which are mostly about how things work, describing the mechanisms that describing the mechanisms in reality, in physical reality, how things operate. That's kind of the point of science, the main point of science. In both of those stories are complementary. Importantly, Peterson insists that the conflict between the so-called conflict between religion and science is not really a conflict between theism and science. It's a conflict between worldviews. And it's a conflict between the naturalistic worldview that includes science and the theistic worldview that also includes science. It's not at the science level that the debate is occurring because both people accept science. It is the way in which they interpret some scientific results and the way in which they kind of extrapolate from those scientific results, the way in which the more general worldview clash or disagree amongst each other. That's where the conflict is at the level of worldviews, naturalism versus theism. But they both have different interpretations of the scientific discoveries. So both theism and theist and atheist must make their case, must argue for their views. It is too facile for the atheist to say there is no appeal to God in science, therefore no God. That's a fallacious move. That's much too quick. And in order to have legitimate discussion, Peterson puts forth what he calls the rules of engagement, the fair rules of engagement, to prevent that fallacious, facile move on the part of the atheist, or fallacious, facile move on the part of the theist as well. Some theists also very naively move from science to God in ways that should not be allowed. So these are the fair rules of engagement to have both sides provide their case and not make any fallacious moves. So the first rule is the following. Any evaluation of religion by science must be decoupled or separated from bias towards metaphysical naturalism. To not accept this rule is to think that methodological naturalism entails metaphysical naturalism, and it does not. Methodological naturalism, again, is the view that in science proper, no theistic explanations are allowed. Put differently, proper scientific explanations are explanations of natural phenomena. That's a methodological principle that distinguishes an activity as science versus non-science. And that's perfectly fine. That's religiously neutral, says Peterson. However, that does not entail or require that there be no God, metaphysical naturalism. That's a separate claim, a claim not required by or not entailed by the enterprise that is science that endorses or incorporates methodological naturalism. To think that a metaphysical naturalism, the claim that there is no God, follows from methodological naturalism, a way of describing the kind of activity that science is to make a mistake. It does not follow. So rule number one is there to prevent people from making that faulty mistake. Second rule, we must expand our idea of what kind of support science could offer religion. Many times a naive move is made that because science does not prove that there's a God, that there is no God. So this looks a lot like the first, the thing that's ruled out by rule number one. But that's not what Peterson's going to try to argue. Peterson, like Roos, they both think that science science itself does not support belief in God, or its negation does not support atheism. Why? Precisely because it is narrowed in this particular way of a methodological naturalism. So to be able to engage in philosophical discussions about God or no God, one must expand our conception of how it is that we should go about answering questions that are not answerable by this narrow conception of science. To insist that our religious claims must be justified using purely scientific means is to rely on scientism. And as we've seen, scientism is faulty, right? There's something inconsistent or something compatible or self-undermining about scientism. So rule number two is a way of keeping clear the faulty trap that comes with scientism. Third, both theism and atheism must make their case regarding science in their own worldviews. Merely point to a scientific observation or result is not enough to count in favor of one or the other, given that both worldviews include scientific results, right? That's just not going to settle one way or the other. So both must make their case. The theist and the atheist must make their case. Quote, and remember, atheistic naturalism must make its own case in relation to science. The atheist must also argue why it is that atheism is correct, not just appeal to science, not allowing theistic explanations. That's again, the faulty move. The theist bears no special burden of proof here, because both the theist and the atheist are making claims that go beyond science, right? Science does not permit theistic claims, religious claims. But both the theist and the atheist are making those claims, right? The theist is saying God exists, and that goes beyond scientific proof. The atheist is saying God does not exist, and that also goes beyond scientific proof. There is no thing you can put on your microscope that reveals that God doesn't exist, right? There's no experiment you can make by the contemporary understandings of science whose result is God doesn't exist. Why? Because science is narrowly construed in this particular way precisely to avoid those questions. So both the theist and the atheist must make their case. So let's talk a little bit about miracles and rationality. Here's a question. Is it reasonable to believe in miracles in the modern world? Can one believe in things like the parting of the sea, this picture here of Moses and the parting of the sea? Is that a reasonable thing to hold in a contemporary scientific age when you have technology, when we can manipulate nature to a large extent, to an extent that would seem magical or miraculous to previous generations? Isn't it more reasonable to think that all of these stories about people walking on water and so on were kind of just clever disguises of scientific kind of discoveries? Can we believe in miracles? Well, let's first make sure that we are talking about the same thing. Let's define the word miracle more carefully. And here's how Peterson does it. A miracle is a violation or a suspension of the laws of nature by a supernatural being not within the physical nature, resulting in an event that would not have occurred through mere natural processes. So a miracle is something that does not happen if you just if the natural causes are allowed to continue. If the natural processes continue, that event will not happen. Like the sea will not open up in the way in which this picture has it. There is no natural processes that allows for that, right? That's just not how the sea naturally works. Can we believe, is it reasonable to believe that the sea was parted this way? Can we reasonably believe that Jesus walked on water? I mean, if the water's frozen, people can walk on it, but the story is not that, right? The story is not that, oh, I guess it was so cold that the water froze and someone can walk on it. That's a purely naturalistic explanation of what it's otherwise a very different story. The story in the New Testament is that Jesus walked on water. And the kind of water that someone else who does not have the supernatural powers would just sink, right? And in fact, part of the story continues in which Peter walks on water and then he sinks because he lacks faith and so on. So it is obvious from the story that this is supposed to be a supernatural intervention, the result of the agency of a being that is not bounded by the laws of nature. That's clearly what's happening in the walking on water. And arguably that's what's happening in the parting of the sea story. So those are miracles as defined by Peterson. Is it reasonable to believe those things if you know contemporary science? Well, here's what Peterson says. Again, he likes probability talk. So M is for miracle, defined this way, like walking on water, parting of the sea in this non-natural way. N is for naturalism, metaphysical naturalism, the view that there is no God. T is for theism, and L is for laws of nature. In laws of nature, you can include like all of the scientific facts. So here is a claim of a probability. The probability that a miracle occurs, given that the laws of nature, knowledge about physics and the natural world science, and that God exists. So if you assume that God exists and you assume that you have all the knowledge about the physical world, what's the probability that a miracle happens given both of those hypotheses, the assumption that those four things are true? Well, here's the claim that Peterson makes. That probability, that conditional probability, is not prohibitively low. In other words, it is reasonable to believe that if God exists, God can intervene with the natural occurrence of things and enable a being to walk on water, or enable, the parting of a sea so that the Israelites can walk through on the bottom of the sea. So it is not prohibitively low. It is reasonable. It could happen, and God could do it. If God exists, God could do it, right? So the probability that it did happen is hard to measure exactly, but it could have happened, right, if God exists. The probability, however, that a miracle exists, a miracle defined in this way, given the assumption of the laws of nature, the way that water typically works and so on, gravity and so on, and naturalism, if you assume that God does not exist. So on the hypothesis that God does not exist and the laws of nature operate the way they do, what's the likelihood, the probability that the miracle would occur given those two things? Well, it's zero, right? It cannot happen. Miracles cannot happen if you, under the hypothesis that there is no God. If there is no God outside of nature to intervene in nature and have things work in a different way, miracles cannot happen. Now, extraordinary events, things that are extremely likely to happen, can happen. That's fine. But a miracle is defined not merely as an extraordinary event, but as an event that cannot be explained by, that would not occur by the natural processes continuing. It has to be an intervention from without that changes the way in which natural processes occur. If that's how we understand a miracle, then the probability of those things happening, given that there is no God and the laws of nature, is zero. So here's the question though. What's the probability that a miracle occurs given the laws of nature alone? You might have heard people say something like, oh, we have plenty of scientific evidence that miracles do not occur. But that's actually a misunderstanding. We have no such evidence. We have plenty of evidence that people don't naturally walk on water, right? So what's the likelihood that someone will walk on water naturally? Well, zero, right? Because water does have enough, it cannot hold up the weight of the person, a normal person. So the evidence that we have is that it is impossible for someone to naturally walk on water. And by natural, I mean part of the natural processes of nature working as they typically do. So we have plenty of evidence that people cannot walk on water naturally, but that is no evidence that it is there are no miracles, because miracles are not defined in terms of the way in which natural processes occur. The miracle is defined as the intervention of someone outside or something outside of the natural order of things, intervening and bringing about something that would not have occurred without that intervention. So what's the likelihood of a miracle given the laws of nature? We actually don't know. Like, we don't have an answer to that question. It is unscrutable, precisely because the laws of nature are not defined to answer those kinds of things. It is only by including things like theism that we have a not prohibitively low probability, or by including naturalism of atheism in the hypothesis or worldview, that we get a number, zero. So science by itself tells us nothing about whether or not miracles occur. It is science plus theism that tells us something, or science plus atheism that tells us something. By itself, it is compatible with either. It is not designed to answer those kinds of questions. What's the likelihood of a miracle occurring given all the facts of nature? We just don't know. The facts of nature by themselves are not enough to tell us it. It's an inscrutable probability. Why? Because it is really the existence or non-existence of something outside of nature that is the thing that would tell us, that is the thing that grounds a probability for miracles happening or not happening. Okay, I'll stop here. I'll see you next time.